There's a building in Chicago that doesn't appear on any city map from 1893. It housed over 100 rooms, its own gas supply, its own kiln, and a private railway track that connected directly to the city's World Fair. Thousands of tourists walked past it every single day that summer. Nobody thought anything was strange. By the time anyone realized what had happened inside, the building had been burned to the ground, twice by the man who owned it. His name was H. Holmes, and the building was not a hotel. Not really. It was something else entirely, something that had been designed from the foundation up to make people disappear. But Holmes is not actually the story I want to tell you today. Because when I started pulling on that thread, the thread of buildings designed to do things their official purpose never admitted, I found something much larger, a pattern that runs across American history from the 1880s all the way to the present. Buildings constructed with hidden infrastructure, secret systems, and alternate functions that were never disclosed to the public. Not just murder houses, not just curiosities. Entire categories of architecture, built specifically to do things that couldn't be done in the open. And the deeper I went, the more I realized we are surrounded by these buildings right now. You have probably been inside one. Let me tell you how Holmes built his castle, because the engineering is the point. In 1887, Herman Webster Mudgett, who was already calling himself H. Holmes, purchased a vacant lot at the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street in the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago. He was 27 years old, a trained physician, and by every available account, extraordinarily charming. He told the neighborhood he was going to build a mixed-use commercial block, ground floor retail, upper floor rooms for rent, perfectly ordinary for a city in the middle of an economic boom. What he actually built was something that confused every contractor who worked on it. Holmes hired construction crews and then fired them before they could finish a section. He hired new crews to build over what the previous crews had done. He supervised portions of the construction personally, insisting on changes mid-build that the workers didn't understand. At any given time, multiple crews were working on different parts of the building with no knowledge of what the other teams were doing. The result, when it was finally complete in 1893, was a building that made no architectural sense. Doors that opened onto brick walls, stairs that led to sealed ceilings, chutes that dropped from upper floors to the basement, too narrow for furniture, but wide enough for a body. A kiln in the basement large enough to cremate a human being, which Holmes described to suppliers as necessary for his medical research. A private railway spur that connected the basement directly to the rail yard, which Holmes described as necessary for receiving large equipment. Now here is what is important to understand about all of this. Not the murders, not Holmes himself, but the fact that this level of architectural deception was possible at all. Nobody stopped him. The city issued permits. The contractors built what they were told. The suppliers delivered the kiln, the chutes, the gas lines without question. Because in 1893 there was no system in place to ask what a building was actually for. You filed a permit describing an intended use. You built. The assumption was that what you said you were building was what you were building. Holmes understood that assumption and exploited it completely. And he was not alone. He was simply the most extreme example of something that was, in that era, surprisingly common. The late 19th century was a period of extraordinary architectural freedom in America. Cities were expanding faster than regulatory systems could track. Building codes were primitive. Inspections were cursory. The gap between what a building was permitted to do and what it actually did was enormous, and a certain class of people knew exactly how to use that gap. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 brought 27 million visitors to a city of barely a million people. Hotels, boarding houses, and rooming establishments of every description opened across the city to capture that traffic. Almost none of them were inspected in any meaningful way. People arrived from across the country, often alone, with cash, and checked into buildings they knew nothing about. A significant number of them never checked out. The estimates of how many people Holmes killed range from 9, which is confirmed, to 200, which is what Holmes himself claimed in a confession he later retracted. The actual number is probably somewhere in between and will never be known, because the building was burned twice and the records were lost. But here is the thing about the Holmes castle that nobody talks about. After it was demolished, after Holmes was caught and hanged in 1896, the city of Chicago looked at that lot on 63rd and Wallace and built a post office on it. A post office, federal infrastructure, on a site that was, functionally, a crime scene covering an unknown number of victims. The post office operated for decades. The ground was never formally excavated. The basement, which was where most of what happened, was poured over with concrete. To this day, nobody knows with certainty what is under that post office floor. The city needed the land, the city needed the postal route, the city built over it and moved on. That decision, pouring concrete over a problem and calling it infrastructure, that is the decision I keep finding when I dig into American architectural history. The Holmes case is disturbing, but it is in some ways the least interesting version of this pattern, because Holmes was a private citizen acting alone. What I want to show you is what happens when the concealed architecture is not the work of a criminal, but of institutions, of governments, of corporations, of systems. Because that version is far more common and far less discussed. In 1958, the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, began an 18-month renovation of its west wing. The Greenbrier was, and still is, one of the most famous luxury hotels in the United States. Presidents had stayed there. European royalty had stayed there. The renovation was described publicly as an expansion and modernization of an already prestigious property. What was actually being built had nothing to do with luxury hospitality. Beneath the new West Wing, under concrete structure that was officially described as an exhibit hall for trade shows, the United States government was constructing a full continuity of government bunker, designed to house all 535 members of Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. The bunker had its own power plant, its own water filtration, its own broadcast studio capable of transmitting to a surviving nation, its own cremation facility for managing deaths during an extended underground stay, and enough dehydrated food to sustain over 1,000 people for months. It was hidden in a luxury hotel. For 35 years. Members of Congress would come to the Greenbrier for retreats and conferences, walking past the entrance to a bunker designed to save their lives, and most of them didn't know it was there. The hotel staff who maintained the facility worked under cover identities. They were employees of a company called Forsyth Associates, which was a fake company. Their actual employer was the United States government. The bunker was only exposed in 1992 when a Washington Post reporter named Ted Gupp published a story revealing its existence. The government immediately decommissioned it, on the grounds that once the secret was out, the facility was useless. 35 years of construction, maintenance, and operational readiness, destroyed as a secret the moment the public learned about it. The Greenbrier bunker is now a tourist attraction. You can take a tour. The government has been very open about it, now that it no longer functions. Transparency after the fact is the preferred mode. But the Greenbrier is not unique. It is not even the most significant example. The Pentagon has approximately 17.5 miles of corridors. That is the official number, and it refers only to the above-ground portion of the building. The sub-basement levels of the Pentagon are not included in public architectural documentation. Their exact configuration and purpose has never been publicly released. During the construction period from 1941 to 1943, over 13,000 workers were employed simultaneously on the project. Compartmentalization was so strict that workers in some sections had no knowledge of what workers in adjacent sections were building. This is not a conspiracy claim, this is construction history. The Pentagon was built to contain classified functions, and the portions designed to contain those functions were built in a way that ensured the people doing the construction didn't understand what they were building. That methodology, the deliberate compartmentalization of construction workers to prevent anyone from understanding the whole, it is a direct descendant of what Holmes did at 63rd and Wallace. The principle is identical. You hire crews, you limit their knowledge, you fire them before they can see the completed picture. You build something that functions differently than it appears. The government institutionalized this approach during World War II and never really stopped. The Manhattan Project construction sites at Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington, employed tens of thousands of workers who had no idea they were building components of a nuclear weapons program. Oak Ridge was a city of 75,000 people that did not appear on any map. Mail sent to Oak Ridge was addressed to a post office box number in Knoxville. People who lived and worked there were not permitted to tell their families where they were. A city of 75,000 people, not on the map. It was removed from secrecy after the war, of course. Retrospective transparency. Oak Ridge is now a normal Tennessee city with a Department of Energy campus. You can visit, you can take tour of some facilities, the ones they want you to see. The government learned this architecture of concealment during the war. The corporations learned it from the government afterward. In 1974, AT&T completed construction on a building at 33 Thomas Street in Lower Manhattan. The building has no windows. It is 29 stories tall, built of reinforced concrete designed to withstand a nuclear blast. and it draws enough electricity to power a small city. Its official purpose has never been publicly confirmed by AT&T or its successor companies. The building is known informally as the Long Lines Building. It was originally designed to house telephone switching equipment, which is true, but is not the complete truth. Long Lines buildings were a network of hardened communications facilities built across the country during the Cold War to ensure that telephone communication could survive a nuclear attack. The Long Lines network was publicly described as civilian telephone infrastructure. It was actually a dual-use military communications system, built with federal funding and federal specifications, operated by a private company. 33 Thomas Street became significant again in 2016 when documents from Edward Snowden's archive, published by The Intercept, identified it as a major NSA surveillance hub where international phone calls were monitored. AT&T and the NSA declined to comment. The building still stands. No windows, blast-hardened, still drawing industrial levels of power, still doing whatever it does. But you don't have to go back to the Cold War to find this pattern. In 2006, a technician named Mark Klein, who had worked for AT&T for 22 years, came forward with documentation of a secret room. Room 641A at AT&T's Folsom Street facility in San Francisco. The room had been installed around 2003. It was accessible only to NSA-cleared personnel. It contained a device capable of monitoring internet traffic at 10 gigabits per second, which in 2003 represented a significant portion of all internet traffic flowing through AT&T's infrastructure. The room was built inside an existing building. The building had a public function, telecommunications switching. The room had a different function, mass surveillance. The building's other employees, including Klein himself for a period, had no idea the room existed. Room 641A was not unique. Klein's documentation suggested similar installations at AT&T facilities in Seattle, San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Diego. A secret room, inside a building, inside a city, doing something the public was never supposed to know about. That is Holmes's methodology. That is the Greenbrier's methodology. Conceal the function inside the architecture. Let the official use provide cover for the actual use. Trust that nobody will look too closely. Now I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a catalogue of paranoia, to say that every building hides a secret room, every renovation conceals a bunker. That is not what I am arguing. What I am arguing is a structural point about how architecture functions in American society, and the structural point is this. Buildings are permitted based on stated use. They are inspected to the extent they are inspected at all based on stated use. They are understood by the public based on stated use, and there has existed throughout American history a consistent gap between stated use and actual use. That gap has been exploited by private criminals, by governments, and by corporations. The methods are different, the scale is different, the moral weight is different. But the underlying architectural principle is identical. You describe a building as one thing. You build it to do another. You rely on the fact that most people do not look at buildings carefully. Here is what I find most unsettling about all of this. The buildings I have described, the Holmes Castle, the Greenbrier Bunker, the Long Lines Building, room 641A, they were all eventually disclosed. We know about them because someone eventually talked. A reporter found documents. A whistleblower came forward. A historian pieced together the records. The secrecy held until it didn't. Which means the ones we know about are the ones where the secrecy failed. The ones where the secrecy held are, by definition, still secret. How many Long Lines buildings are there that we have not identified? How many secret rooms and facilities we have never heard of? How many structures exist right now, in cities we live in, with permitted uses that bear no relationship to their actual function? I genuinely do not know. Nobody outside those systems knows. That is precisely the point. What I do know is that the conditions that made all of this possible, the gap between permitted use and actual use, the compartmentalization of construction, the assumption that buildings are what they say they are, those conditions have not changed. If anything, they have intensified. Construction technology is more sophisticated. Concealment is easier. The digital infrastructure that runs through modern buildings is almost entirely invisible to the people who occupy them. The data centers being built right now across Northern Virginia, in suburban Phoenix, in rural Iowa, they are described as cloud computing infrastructure. Some of them are exactly that. Some of them are also other things. Which ones are which is not publicly knowable. H. Holmes was caught because he made a financial mistake. He overinsured a horse that didn't exist. A fraud scheme that had nothing to do with his building. and the investigation that followed eventually led detectives to 63rd Street. If he hadn't been greedy about a fake horse, the castle might never have been examined. The post office might have been built on top of it without anyone ever knowing what was below. The Greenbrier bunker was exposed because a single reporter spent years following fragments of documentation until they cohered into a story. If Ted Gupp had not been persistent, the bunker would still be operating today, still maintained by fake employees from a fake company, still waiting for a nuclear attack that never came. Mark Klein came forward on principle. He didn't have to. Most people in his position don't. The pattern of disclosure is always the same: an accident, a persistent individual, someone who decided that the truth was worth the risk of telling it. Buildings are not neutral. They are arguments made in concrete and steel about what a society does and what it hides. Every hidden room is a decision. Every sealed basement is a choice. Every structure designed to look like one thing while being another is a statement about who gets to know what, and who is expected to simply walk past without asking any questions. We have spent a lot of time looking up at the skylines of American cities and thinking about what they say about us: the ambition, the engineering, the reach. We have spent much less time asking what the buildings are actually for. That question, I would suggest, is the more important one. And the more you ask it, the more interesting the answers become. If this is the kind of thing you want to keep following, subscribe, because the next investigation goes somewhere even these buildings don't go.